morning, everyone. We will start in 5 minutes, so may I please encourage everyone to please be seated. As we are about to begin, please be seated. I am Alistina Shrestha, and it is my pleasure to be the MC for the Water Security and Climate Change Conference 2022. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the conference. The conference has been designed to cover various aspects of water security and climate change, ranging from policy to practice, from fundamental research to action research, from integrated thinking to inclusive development, and addressing almost every single sustainable development goal directly or indirectly. We hope that you will find the deliberations of the conference relevant, useful, and insightful. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements. Kindly switch your mobile phones to the silent mode during the sessions. We have a packed schedule for 3 days, so I request you to please ensure that you arrive for the sessions on time. In view of the COVID protocols, we encourage you to wear a mask. In case you need one, please feel free to get one from the registration counter. At the time of the registration, you must have received a T-shirt which has been generously been sponsored by DAD German Academic Exchange Services Global Centers on Climate and Environment Program. We urge you to please wear these t-shirts for today's gala dinner in the evening. Lastly, please reach out to the organizers for any assistance. The team is wearing name tags with red lanyard. This will help you identify them easily. To kick off this program, please allow me to welcome the chair of the conference, Professor Mukund Babel, to set the context for WSCC 2022.
Very good morning to all. It's my pleasure to be here to give you kind of an context and overview of the conference. The idea of this conference was conceived in 2015, and we had our first edition of this Water Security and Climate Change Conference in 2016. So the first edition was in 2016, and this is 6th edition. So we started this concept or this conference in 2016. 2017 it was organized in Germany. 2018 we were in Kenya. In 19 we were in Africa. In 2020 we could not do it because of the COVID. And 2021 it was in a online mode in Hanoi. And this time we are back to Bangkok with this 6th edition of this conference. The whole idea of this conference is to bring in these scientists and policymakers and stakeholders when it comes to water security, diverse domain of disciplines and areas. So we would like to bring them all together. That's the first one. The second one, that we would like to go beyond science. So science to development, and this would be reflected through this conference this year in a better way. The third and most important is that we would like to kind of create an environment where innovative ideas and pathways can be developed for the implementation of solutions to the problems. So overall, our objective of this conference this year is to proliferate the exchange of knowledge and practical know-how on the very, very intrinsic relationship which is between water and climate. And this was the kind of philosophy we had, that let's bring this climate and water communities together, and how water can help addressing climate issues. In order to advance this fundamental and action research, and we expect by end of this 3 days, we have a very packed program, which you must have seen in your program booklet. The idea is to provide an enabling environment, or this is what we expect after 3 days, so that we can plug in those gaps which are either requiring fundamental research or action-oriented research. so that we address this water security or water insecurity challenges. So this year, specifically, our focus is on adaptation for sustainable and resilient development with 3 themes. The first theme is that how can we transition from this sectorial thinking to nexus thinking. The second theme is how do we robustify our climate change adaptation strategies. The third one, which is how research for development aspect comes, is through how do we translate knowledge into action. As said earlier, this is a very, very compact 3 days, and what we have done is that we would have, as in most conferences, the plenary sessions and the parallel sessions. In order to accommodate, I am very happy to inform you that we receive overwhelming response from various partner organizations for this conference. And I had to also say that on the second day, we will have 4 parallel sessions in order to accommodate all these responses which we received. So I will briefly tell you about the day 1 program. The day 1 program, you would see that there's something is in person and something is in hybrid. So afternoons are in hybrid. And before that, let me also give you an overview kind of, we have 5 keynote sessions with 7 keynote speakers. We have 12 technical sessions with 64 presentations. We have 17 partner sessions. We have 2 special sessions, 4 side events, and 1 high-level panel discussion before we have our closing. So we will start, our official opening would be in the afternoon at 1:30, and in the morning we'll have 2 keynotes with moving to 3 parallel sessions. Then we will break for lunch, and then we start with the opening in the afternoon at 1:30 with a keynote in the afternoon. Then we have 6 partner sessions in the afternoon and evening before we meet for a gala dinner in this hall at 7:30. The second day, as I said earlier, we will start with keynote in the morning. That would be the 4th keynote lecture. Then we have 4 parallel sessions, technical sessions they are. So mornings are all in person, and during the whole day, this is live stream on YouTube. So online participants can join from the morning to evening through YouTube, but also through Zoom during these partner sessions. So this is the second day program. We also have dinner at 7. We will announce the venue maybe end of the day or tomorrow morning. The third day, we start with again a keynote in the morning at 8:30, followed by 3 parallel sessions, technical sessions, then 2 special sessions and a side event. In the afternoon, we have a high-level panel discussion at 3:20 in the afternoon. That will be immediately followed by the closing session. So basically, I would like to conclude my kind of overview by adding one additional thing, that one of the side event is on 4th of December, Sunday, where we are having this water security assessment tool which was developed at AIT, this training workshop for about 25 participants. And these are already selected. This is for selected participants, but just for your information. So with that, I look forward to discussions, deliberations, and feel free to interact with all the participants who are joining this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Babel, for the overview of WSCC 2022. It is now time for our first keynote address of the conference by Professor Mihir Shah from the Shiv Nadu University, India. The moderator of this session is Professor Anamika Barua, who is a professor in ecological economics in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati, India. I would now like to invite Professor Anamika to please come over and run the session.
Good morning, everyone. It is a proud privilege for me to introduce you to Dr. Mihir Shah. Dr. Shah, who is a brilliant economist, one of India's leading scholars, activists, and policymaker on water management and rural livelihood. Although Dr. Shah does not really need a detailed introduction, and in today's digital world, you can just Google his name and you can get all the information, I thought to do it in a little different way by bringing 3 very important points about him, which actually brought paradigm shifts in India's particularly water policy. So let me begin with very quickly giving you a background of Dr. Shah, who was a member of Planning Commission, Government of India. He was the youngest ever member of Planning Commission, and he is admired for the paradigm shift he brought in the management of water resources and initiated in the 12th five-year plan. Because this was the first time we saw a water policy talking about inequity, sustainability, water use efficiency, participatory planning, reuse and recycle, groundwater regulation, and several such other very important points which were never spoken so boldly. I say boldly because this was the first time an emphasis was raised that we need to shift our focus from supply augmentation only to water demand management. His second biggest paradigm shift that he brought was one of the flagship program of Government of India, which is known as MG-NREGA, which is employment program. As chairman of the Government of India's Committee for Revision of MG-NREGA guidelines, he initiated a makeover of MG-NREGA, the largest employment program in human history, with a renewed emphasis on rural livelihoods based on construction of productive assets. Let me add here that NREGA is not just about livelihood generation, it is also about giving a dignified life to socially excluded rural communities, and it also led to women empowerment as many got employed under the scheme. Finally, where I also met Dr. Shah in person was in 2019, because from 2019 to 2021, Dr. Shah chaired the Government of India's committee to draft the new national water policy. And the draft prepared by the committee under Dr. Shah's chairmanship is under review. Once it is out, it will be the first water policy which adopted a participatory approach with a gender lens while drafting it. And again, it brings yet another paradigm shift in water management, glimpse of which today you will see in Dr. Shah's presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's put our hands together to invite Dr. Shah onto the dais.
A very good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. An over-generous introduction by my friend Anamika, who I had a great pleasure working with, as she described, on drafting a new national water policy. It was a committee formed by the Government of India for the first time, chaired by a person from outside the government and including leading experts like her on water policy in India. So what I thought I'll do today is to briefly recount for you the experience that I have had in these last 10 years, which she was just describing, of trying to introduce systems thinking into water and locating it in the context, the urgent context of climate change. Because this is a unique experience. This has opened up new kinds of possibilities, not just for India, but for all those engaged in this very challenging task of drafting a new approach to water, a new paradigm for water in the era of the Anthropocene. So I present to you two essential arguments. The first is that in this attempt at drafting a new paradigm for water management, I think what we all realized is that policymakers across the world do not factor in, as they should, the essential features of water. If you don't do that, you're bound to go wrong in the policies and programs that you formulate. So the first question for policy is, how well do we know water? And the second most important element, which this conference is very rightly focused on, is that unless we recognize the relationships that water has to several distinct but deeply interrelated sectors of the economy and society, we will not be able to formulate meaningful policies and programs for water. So the second question for policy is, do we only know water? I don't have to describe to you the essential features of water, but it's ironic that for policymakers it's now become essential for me to begin with this slide. Because when you look at the way we have designed our programs and policies, we find that we have ignored what must be regarded as the absolutely key distinctive features of water as a resource. The first, that water is a shared common pool resource. The second, that water exists in conditions of great diversity. Third, that there is a profound interconnectedness among all elements of the water cycle. And fourth, that water is a renewable but still finite resource. When we look at policies and programs, the actions we have taken on water across the world, we find that we have ignored these fundamental features that I just outlined. And there has been an urge towards what I call domination and command, manipulation and control, unlimited extraction, unbridled competition, and the notion that one size can actually fit all, disregarding the diversity that we see in water. So what I'll do is to illustrate initially to you with examples of how we have ignored these features and also suggest what we need to do to change course, to build a new paradigm for water management and governance. The first simple observation that I would like to share with you is that we have ignored the shared common pool resource nature of groundwater. And when groundwater is extracted endlessly by individual users competing with each other, what it results in is a rapid depletion of the resource in quantity and quality, even its irrevocable mining in so many cases, where groundwater had taken thousands of years to accumulate below the ground. But in the last few decades itself, we have literally mined this resource so that aquifers have become empty and have had to be abandoned. The second example is about how aquifers are very different, as you all know, in their storage and transmission characteristics. But what we have done is to do a one-size-fits-all. We have used methods of drilling groundwater, which may be suitable, let's say, for an alluvial aquifer formation, but we have applied them indiscriminately to hard rock formations where the natural rates of groundwater recharge are very low, which has led to a fall in both the quantity and quality of groundwater. The third illustration that I wanted to share with you is that we have a profound interconnectedness between different elements of the water cycle. So if we look at water which is in rivers or stored in any kind of water body that is man-made, it has a very deep connection with the health of the catchment areas from where this water body is catching its water. But disregarding this interconnection, we have undertaken highly destructive activities in the catchment areas of our rivers and water bodies, which has deeply and adversely impacted river systems. An example is the drying up of many of India's major rivers, many of whose water flows have declined, some of whom have completely dried up. The fact is that over-extraction of groundwater in the catchments of these rivers has meant that the base flows of groundwater which feed these river systems have completely dried up, and so that in the post-monsoon period we find heavily depleted flows in the rivers that are dotting the Indian landscape. Apart from ignoring the interconnections of different elements of the water cycle, what we have completely forgotten, as I mentioned earlier, is systems thinking. We have not understood that water is deeply interconnected to other sectors, and there is a new context within which we need to plan water programs and policies. The first, as you all know, is climate change. Today, the water cycle does not operate within an invariant band of predictability, which means the past can no longer be a definite indicator of what is to come in the future. And all our water planning is based on that assumption of stationarity. And I think we need to urgently look into, and I'm sure the deliberations of this conference will help policymakers understand that stationarity is no longer a good assumption. So how do we make our policies much building in resilience, agility, flexibility, and adaptability? Without these key 4 features of policy in the era of climate change, we will continue to go wrong. I will illustrate each of these points in my presentation, but just to recount briefly the frameworks that govern water. First is the framework of competing water users, the energy policy framework, the research and training framework, which we must look at when we are at the Asian Institute of Technology, the legal framework governing water, and the framework of governance within which we make all our decisions regarding water. So, climate change, fresh challenges with the impacts on the hydrologic cycle, more extreme rates of precipitation, which exacerbate the impacts of both floods and droughts, intense, extreme, and variable rainfall, combined with lack of proper drainage, means that dirty water is today entering our homes, adding to filth and disease. And a natural consequence of what is going on is that water conflicts among water users and water users are becoming more and more common every passing day. And unless we make the change, the paradigm shift that we require to factor in the uncertainties created by climate change, these conflicts are only going to get worse over time. Let me illustrate what I mean by the framework of competing water users. So the most important sector in many parts of the globe, which deeply impacts what we do in water, is agriculture. Take the example of India. Agriculture takes up 90%. This is the latest data available from the FAO's Aquastate database, which tells us that 90% of India's water is being taken by agriculture. But India's public procurement system, whereby the government procures the crops grown by farmers at an assured minimum support price, is overwhelmingly focused on wheat and rice. 95% of India's public procurement still is entirely centered on wheat and rice, and rice, wheat, and sugarcane, which sugarcane has a steady private demand, consume more than 80% of water going to irrigation in India. Without diversifying the portfolio of public procurement of grains, without diversifying India's cropping pattern, access to water for small and marginal farmers, who constitute now more than 85% of India's farmers, and assuring water security, domestic water security for urban and rural consumers, will become absolutely impossible. So here is an example of how farm policy, agriculture policy, is actually making it impossible to solve India's water problem. Another example of the same nexus of interconnection between different users and users of water is provided by a phenomenon that we observe across the world, that when you have an aquifer which is providing drinking water to habitations in any kind of location, especially rural, that same aquifer, when it is used for irrigation of these kinds of water-intensive crops, the drinking water supply source runs dry. Because as you know, agriculture consumes an overwhelmingly larger amount of volume of water compared to domestic water. So habitation after habitation, this is the kind of drinking water crisis that we are creating simply because we have not done a systems approach to managing water resources. We have not brought drinking water and irrigation together in our planning, in our programs, in our policies, and thereby we are actually engendering through our own mechanisms a growing crisis of water. A similar problem arises when you locate water-intensive industries in water-scarce regions without giving a thought to what will happen to the drinking water security of people who are living in those regions. The energy policy framework. Again, all of you are aware of the groundwater energy nexus. And what this does by providing both energy and water freely to farmers is that there is an increasing depletion of groundwater levels and quality. However, economists are tempted to suggest, therefore, that we should go in for marginal cost pricing of water. I think that would be in itself also a disaster, because we do not want to kill the golden goose, which is providing us with all the groundwater on which the economy survives. So what we can do, and a solution has been attempted, what Anamika was indicating, in the last 10 years, we have tried to find practical solutions whereby what we do is to provide high quality power to the farming sector in a rationed way. Let's say for 8 hours, different states have adopted different number of hours that will make this power available to farmers. It is a limited quantity, but it's assured. And what that does is that farmers are much more rational and equitable in their use of water. And at the same time, 24/7 power is provided to schools, hospitals, and living habitations. And what this has done, according to recent studies, is that it has impacted groundwater tables very positively, while also resolving the problem of water supply in these especially remote regions. While we may fault the policymakers and the frameworks they have adopted, I think we must also realize that the education our water professionals are getting in leading institutions across the world still remains outdated in an old paradigm. It is, if I may use the phrase coined by a friend of mine, Margaret Zortien, at the IHE in Delft in Holland, we are dominated by what may be called the masculinities in water, which I was referring to earlier, the command and control over river systems, the attempt to interlink various river systems, the attempt to endlessly extract water needs to change towards an understanding of water where we are attempting to weave our interventions into the contours of nature, where we become students of nature rather than those who are trying to exercise a command and control over it. Since systems such as water are greater than the sum of their constituent parts, solving water problems necessarily requires multidisciplinary teams engaged in interdisciplinary projects based on a transdisciplinary approach. So our research and teaching framework has to move from the kind of silo-driven way of teaching water towards this kind of transdisciplinary understanding, so that our trained water professionals would be able to become active participants in the new water paradigm that is emerging across the world. It may amaze some of you, but large parts of the world are still governed by an outmoded legal framework as far as water is concerned, which dates from the 19th century, what is called British common law. The common law of absolute dominion means that landowners have a right to take substantially as much groundwater as they desire from wells that are dug on their own land. And in order to explain how dangerous that situation is, I'm quoting from a legal judgment which still dominates the legal framework of water in India. I'm quoting from an 1843 judgment, which, just to give you a flavor of what actually happens on the ground when legal systems like these are applied to groundwater. And I quote, "The person who owns the surface may dig therein and apply all that is there found on his own purposes at his free will and pleasure. And that, if in the exercise of such right, he intercepts or drains off the water collected from underground springs in his neighbor's well, this inconvenience to his neighbor falls within the description of damnum absque injuria, damage without injury which cannot become the ground of an action," unquote. Even if, therefore, your actions, your endless extraction of groundwater is going to hurt somebody's basic access to water for life, no legal action can be initiated against you, given the provisions of British common law, which still rules across many parts of the world and creates endless problems for those who do not have the resources to actually prevent such outcomes from happening. In order to redress this grave injustice and anomaly, the Government of India invited me to chair a committee to draft what we called a National Water Framework Law. This is a framework law which outlines the principles and practices which all states and all primary stakeholders of water will adopt, and in case they don't, there would be a possibility of legal action being initiated against them. So in order to support the kind of actions and practices that we are trying to facilitate through the paradigm shift in water, we are also into developing a new legal framework which would enable these actions to go faster on the ground. The Supreme Court of India has, over the recent past, enunciated what it calls the public trust doctrine, where the state becomes a trustee of the water resources being used by primary stakeholders, so that in case any action by any stakeholder endangers the right to water for life of any other stakeholder, that kind of action is legally liable. And there are many legal judgments on which this new National Water Framework Law is based. It also means that the fundamental right to water is being read as part of the fundamental right to life enshrined in India's constitution. It also means the affirmation of the principle of subsidiarity, which is to look for solutions to water closest to where the problem exists. This is a framework of decentralized governance enunciated in the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments to the Indian Constitution. It also means the affirmation of the prevention and precautionary principles statutorily recognized in the National Green Tribunal Act of 2010, and it also means the transparency provisions of India's Right to Information Act 2005 have also been invoked within the National Water Framework Law. So essentially a very comprehensive framework to enable the paradigm shift in water to take place. But I would finally like to draw your attention to the kind of governance structures that we have set up which make it very difficult to initiate the paradigm shift in water. And in the recent draft of the new national water policy, which we have prepared and submitted to the Government of India, which Anamika was referring to, we have suggested 3 broad kinds of governance reform that water requires. The first is to bring in a transdisciplinary expertise that I was talking about. Today you look at government departments across the world. In India you look at the national government, the state governments. Professionals in these departments come primarily from civil engineering, hydrology and hydrogeology. But as you can imagine, in this new framework of systems thinking, where we look at all the frameworks governing water, we need multidisciplinary expertise covering water management, social mobilization, anthropology, agronomy, soil science, hydrometeorology, public health, river ecology, and ecological economics. All of these are required if we are going to be able to make this paradigm shift really possible. And it's important, therefore, for all teaching institutions, those who are running programs on water, to incorporate these disciplines when we are preparing our water professionals for the 21st century. The second is to overcome what I call the hydroschizophrenia, which characterizes all water planning and policy. There are 3 kinds of silos into which we have divided water: surface and groundwater, irrigation and drinking water, and water and wastewater. Without bringing these silos into which we have divided water, without bridging them, rivers will continue to run dry due to depletion of their feeder aquifers. Drinking water sources will be exhausted because of competing demands of irrigation, and water quality will continue to decline because of the way our wastewater is getting mixed with our water supply systems. Any water supply project must have built into it, that's our strong recommendation, a plan and a program for treating wastewater and only then making water supply systems work on the ground. And finally, the third governance reform is to build enduring multi-stakeholder partnerships. Because wisdom of water is not the exclusive preserve of any one sector or section of society. Governments need to build a novel architecture of partnerships with primary stakeholders of water based on respectful dialogue and mutual learning. What tends to happen is, an organization like the Asian Institute of Technology will be invited by a government to give its advice, and then whether that advice is heeded or forgotten is something that depends on the policy maker, to the whims and fancies, as I say, of passing bureaucrats and politicians. And I think what we need to do is to build enduring relationships with primary stakeholders, which is based on respectful dialogue and mutual learning. This includes the indigenous knowledge of local communities with a long history of water management, which is, I believe, an invaluable intellectual resource that must be fully leveraged. Otherwise, the kinds of challenges that I was speaking about will remain impossible to be tackled without profound people's participation, especially under the leadership of women. We will not be able to solve the enormous challenges that we are facing in water today. So I'll just conclude by recounting the major propositions I put forward before you. There is an urgent need for policies and programs of water to build in the differentia specifica of water, which includes the finitude, the interconnectedness, the diversity, and the common pool resource nature of water. Not doing so has meant that we are engendering deeper crises of water. these are actually crises of water which we are ourselves creating. Drying up of rivers, falling water tables and water quality, water conflicts, and aggravating the impacts of climate change. Water problems, therefore, cannot be solved without a paradigm shift in sectors deeply connected to water, as also in the determining, governing frameworks of water. These include the framework of competing water users, the energy policy framework, the research and training framework, the legal framework, and the framework of governance, which is used to manage and govern water across the world. I believe the time has come when we can no longer ignore the challenges that the old paradigm of water poses, especially made urgent in this era of climate change. I'm sure with all of you working together, with all of us trying to forge and make an impact on policy and programs in our own countries across the globe, we can hopefully look forward to a much better future in water for our children and for the generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shah, for his very insightful and interesting presentation. We have around 10 minutes. We can take some questions from the floor. 5 minutes? Okay. So maybe 1 or 2 quick questions. If you can keep your questions brief. Yeah.
Just a quick question from my side is, I'm Vishnu from Nepal. You know, you rightly talk about that we need a well mix of different expertise for making the system thinking and governance work in water, right? It sounds catchy, everyone agrees that, there is no question at all. But how to make it happen is a real challenge. When we have a highly heterogeneous mix of people, so how to make it really happen? Do you have any experience of that? Thank you.
That's right. Thank you for that. Should I? Yeah. So, you know, it's a very good question, and this is a question I've been trying to address over the last few years. The university where I work, the Shiv Nadar University in India, we have initiated a very radically new kind of program in water. It's called the Masters of Science in Water Science and Policy, an MSc in Water Science and Policy. It's a 2-year program where we do precisely this. We are bringing together interdisciplinary expertise, and students are now expected to learn not just engineering solutions, but all of the disciplines I mentioned. And our students also include people from governments and who come for, let's say, modular programs, because they can't come for 2 years. So we design specific modules for policymakers who are, let's say, trained in one kind of discipline and want to understand how what they are doing is connected to the other academic disciplines that are required. We are also working with primary stakeholders from civil society who come and learn about a new perspective on water. But of course, one university doing it is not going to be enough. All of us, and we are at the Asian Institute of Technology, if we all of us decide that we will build these kinds of new academic programs, I think the problem that you are pointing to, which is a very valid one, that we don't have professionals trained in this transdisciplinary perspective, that problem can genuinely be overcome, and governments can be provided, civil society can be provided, primary stakeholders can be provided with such people who can guide the development of this paradigm shift over time.
Another quick question.
Okay, my name is Nader from Iranian Agriculture and Engineering Research Institute. Thank you for your comprehensive presentation. But my question is that we are in severe shortage of water. And this solution that we change the paradigm to make reforms and etc., it needs long time, maybe in a long time, and could be useful. But the water crisis, especially in arid regions, is so severe that we need some short-term solutions. And these reforms maybe takes long times. And also, its implementation is a question. We have also good rules, and we modified the laws, everything in our country, but it is not implemented. They do same as previous actions. So
Right.
what is your solution for this?
Right.
Thank you.
No, it's a very good question. It's a question I'm asked all the time. Because I'm sure you're not one of those who want to resist this change. But I can assure you the establishment does not like what I am talking about. They want to make it impossible for this paradigm shift to occur because there is a huge political economy of corruption that I'm sure all of you are aware of in the way the water projects are implemented. So all the time we are asked, well, this is okay in the long term, what will you do in the short term? My counter question is, we have been saying this for the last so many years, and we have postponed making this paradigm shift and gone for short-term solutions which have only aggravated the water crisis. You know, when I talked about the over-extraction of groundwater, that is the short-term solution everybody pushes for, making more and more large dams across our river systems. But they have had disastrous consequences for the water sector and do not allow for a new approach to take shape in the era of climate change. It's very important to build in agility, flexibility, and these elements are missing. I can assure you that each of the propositions I made to you have implementable solutions in the short term. You know, when I said diversifying the cropping pattern, it's a very simple solution, has been worked out in many parts of India. See, the question people ask is, if you diversify the cropping pattern away from wheat and rice and introduce, what we are saying is introduce millets, pulses and oilseeds, each of which faces a crisis in the countries we are speaking about. People say, then what will we do with those crops? The answer is, if you diversify your public procurement portfolio, it can be done with one stroke of the pen. It has been done in many states where people are now procuring these ecologically appropriate, location appropriate crops, and then these crops are being introduced into the midday meals which are provided to children in schools, into the preschool children centers, you know, what's called the integrated child development services. These are the two largest feeding programs for children in human history. Imagine the kind of demand we create for ecologically appropriate, less water intensive crops. This also can be done by one stroke of the pen. It means one season of incentivizing farmers to grow less water consuming crops. And there is a technical paper we recently wrote for the FAO which shows the volumes of water that can be saved and made available, you know, for drinking water and other purposes. So these solutions are not, yes, it is taking a long-term view of water, it is understanding the trends in water, but the implementation can begin from tomorrow if we can push our governments to do that. And there too, the good news is precisely what you said. There is a water crisis very severely facing our people, and more there is pressure on governments to deliver on water. Because the old 20th century solutions are no longer working. Because they are not working, the policy makers are looking for new solutions. That's why somebody like me, who's opposing the establishment on water, has been invited to chair all these government committees to become part of the attempt to find new solutions for new challenges.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shah. Because of the time paucity, we have to close the session, but we wish you all the best, that the new water policy that you have drafted get accepted soon, and we see the first paradigm shift in India. Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Shah, just 1 minute. There is a small felicitation.
Thank you, Professor Mihir Shah and Professor Anamika Barua. I would now like to request Professor Anamika to please present a souvenir to Professor Mihir Shah. Let us now move on to the second keynote address of this session, which will be done by Dr. Elena Lopez-Gunn, Director of iCatalyst Spain. The moderator of this session is Professor Andreas Hastrick, who is a professor of bioprocess engineering at the Technical University of Braunschweig. I request Professor Andreas to please moderate this session.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are realizing today, in these days, is that freshwater systems are on high risk. And freshwater more and more becomes a rarely precious good. Rara sunt cara. Actually, this is not a new recognition, and the risks are also known, not new. But climate change nowadays accelerates the problems and sets many areas under pressure. But the rising risks can also offer opportunities. But how to transfer these risks into useful actions? How nexus thinking can push us forward in this case? But one thing is clear. Imagine, we are not anymore in the position of acting in a preventive way, but rather more than in a reactive way. I have the honor to introduce to you Dr. Elena Lopez-Gunn. She is the founder and director of iCatalyst. That is a Spanish startup specialized in climate change, adaptation, and sustainability. She is a lead author for the WG2, that is a working group assessing impacts of climate change of the IPCC, and she's member of the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. Before that, she worked at the London School of Economics as an ALSOA research fellow, focusing on water governance and sustainable water management. She also worked at the Botin Foundation, that is a think tank that is focusing on new evidence on key policy questions both in Spain and globally. She also collaborated with a number of organizations such as UNESCO, FAO, UNDP, and European Union. I would like to ask Dr. Gunn to come here, and it's my honor to introduce her now. Please give her a clapping hand. Also over there.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think I hope that what I can provide helps with building really in what Professor Shah just introduced. I think we're going to be giving a similar message that, you know, in the kind of context of climate change, it really is changing the game, and the only way that we can, I think, adapt is by adopting a system thinking. Okay. Okay, so in a way, the inspiration for the talk was really thinking about the conference. You know, it was going to be one of the first talks. So I wanted to kind of build a narrative on the three themes for this conference. And I started with a quick summary, because I think it makes much more sense, you know, if I have to be quick, but at least I'm going to give you my key message at the very beginning. So the talk will focus on how these climate change, you know, risks are really mediated through water. And I'm going to very quickly summarize some of the results of this chapter 4 of the working group 2 of the IPCC, which is basically the water chapter. Later on, you will have another keynote speaker from the chapter lead author. So I'm going to just give some hints on what this chapter is basically indicating in terms of the evidence. But I think the kind of key central message that you have to take away is that water is central to climate change adaptation. So we have a huge role to play in the future, not just for our sector, but for all the other sectors. They're going to need us, and I think we have a lot of value to bring to this kind of system transformation that we're talking about. And I'm going to basically give you 2 examples from 2 projects that we're involved in at the moment that give some indications of how we could actually make this deep transformation. Okay, so again, building on the themes of this conference, as you can see, we're talking about water security. In fact, this was a central concept that we adopted in the chapter on water for the IPCC. It was a kind of the core with this idea that we're entering into an area of water risks, and I think you live in a region that I don't have to say how over the last year, you know, your countries, and I'm thinking particularly of the case of Pakistan, really understood what we're talking about. And the scale is huge. At the same time, you know, we have to understand that when we adopt nexus thinking, that is actually really going to help us. So if we stay only within water, we will not have the solutions. We need to reach out to other sectors and work with them. Because when we're talking, for example, about energy transformation, which is shifting to renewables, you know, in a way to start the decarbonization of all our sectors. In fact, water is going to be critical, because many of the kind of fossil energies, for example, are very water intensive, not just CO2 intensive. And how do we actually turn this knowledge into action? How do we actually go further and faster? And I'm thinking of my colleague from Iran. I also come from a water-scarce country, and indeed, we are in an emergency. We have to act quickly because we don't have time. And basically, turning this same logic into a process, as you can see here, this is really describing the talk that I'm going to be giving today, which I'm going to start with the impacts. We're not talking about the future anymore. We're talking about the present. We're talking about evidence, observed impacts that now can be attributed to climate change. I'm then going to talk very briefly about adaptation strategies, then thinking about this idea of nexus transformation. So talking about the key concept of the IPCC Working Group 2 report is this idea of transforming systems. And we're talking about nexus transformation in our case, to then talk about actionable knowledge. Okay, so basically what you can see here is that, and this is not new to all of us that come from the water sector. We've seen floods, the case of Pakistan, but not just Pakistan, also Nigeria, other countries that have also experienced, very, very, very substantial impacts, with a large percentage of the GDP being affected and people migrating. And we're talking millions. We're not talking small-scale impacts. We're talking large-scale impacts. But we also see melting glaciers. Even in Europe, we're having situations where, areas that were stable are now having big landslides, and it's all because the ice is becoming, is being destabilized, the whole system. But of course, the water towers of the world are being impacted, where many, many people depend for their drinking water on these melting glaciers. But we also have droughts. I don't have to mention the Horn of Africa, what it's going through at the moment. My own country at the moment, we have one of our basins, the Guadalquivir Basin, which is really now entering empty. It's empty now. The reservoirs, huge reservoirs that are capable of storing water for 10 years are now running on empty. This is, I was talking to someone from the head of planning from this water authority. He was saying, we don't know what to do now. We are entering the space that we're running out of solutions. But at the same time, we have storms and hurricanes. The case, for example, of Florida, where they had a hurricane, that, they're still kind of trying to reconstruct. But what is important is this impacts, if you think about it, and this is why it's so relevant for this conference. All these impacts are mediated through water. That is the kind of common theme and language running through all this, which is why at one point when I started to, I was coming from the water sector and I started to migrate to climate change adaptation. But to me it was a logical migration because in a way H2O is, to adaptation what CO2 is to mitigation. I think we, if we keep this in mind, we will see the value that we have to bring to these discussions. And as you can see here, and I'm going to now briefly present, and I have some of my colleagues from, I think I saw Vishnu here a moment ago. Hi, Vishnu. We're going to meet in person for the first time. We were working remotely for 2 years, so it's going to be very nice to meet some of the co-authors of this chapter. So as you can see here, climate change has affected all components of the water cycle and all water use sectors in all regions, and the most impacts are actually negative. But what I've highlighted there is that, and I think this to me is one of the things that I really take away from this report as compared to the previous one, is that in our chapter, I remember towards the end we had to change the order because we realized that in fact it made more sense to separate and first talk about the observed impacts and then talk about projected impacts. Why? Because now half the chapter is about observed impacts. It's not about the future, it is about the present. And this is documented evidence from, analyzing, published literature. So basically, in a way, it's this kind of wake-up call that we really have to take action now. And as you can see here, and again, I've underlined, when you actually look at the kind of column there, we're talking about, the cryosphere impacts on the groundwater, on drought, on water quality. All these impacts, these are general impacts, and they're all mediated through water, which is why, I think we can bring a lot of expertise to addressing these impacts. And as you can see here, what we're seeing in terms of the evidence is that the world is becoming wetter and drier at the same time, and it affects different regions differently. But at the same time, in a country like mine, for example, you also have what we call cascading risks or compounded risks, which is basically a situation that I have actually seen in my country, we're in the middle of a drought. You know, we have a very extreme rain event, and suddenly we have, our systems basically flooded. You know, or we even had, for example, a situation in Catalonia, near Barcelona, where they had a hail event, and a baby actually died because the ice was this size. These are events that literature talks about it, thinks it will happen, but it's actually we think happening faster than we actually ever imagined. And we now have 163 million people that are seeing drier conditions, and we're also having almost 500 million people having wetter conditions. You know, and as Professor Shah mentioned, we need to adapt all our systems, including governance, indeed, because they need to deal with a changing situation. And these systems are not adapted, so we need to change the institutions as well to cope with these changes. And then we should not forget ecosystems. At the end of the day, if we're all water scientists, you know, we come from a natural system, ultimately, is one of the biggest systems, is the kind of bloodstream of our planet, which is the waters, the river, the rivers, the groundwater, the aquifers, basically all these systems, give us resilience in the context of climate change, but only if we take care of them. If we overexploit them, we will really damage their capacity to respond and help us adapt to climate change. So then I'm moving now to the adaptation strategies, and you would say, okay, we've looked at the impacts, we now understand that all the impacts are mediated through water, so how does that impact adaptation? And I think, Aditi Mukherjee will probably look at this in more depth, because this is one of kind of the central elements that she looked at in the chapter. But I think it's really quite a given statistic when you actually see that 60% of all adaptation is occurring in response to water hazards. Water is critical to adaptation. And I think what is really important is that water is a hazard, but it's also a response. Is one of the most effective adaptation strategies you can adopt is having good water management. And particularly systemic good water management, building on the previous speaker. So, as I said there, you have increased water-related hazards due to climate change, but water is also a key entry point for adaptation measures of responses. And then, in a way, this is the world that we're coming from. We're coming from a world where we have water. We're managing, for example, hydropower stations. We're managing, for example, our public water supply systems. And this is the world that we inhabit. And then we have people that live in the kind of agriculture space, and they're thinking about how to have bigger crops, how they can, in a way, secure their income for their farmers. Or you have the energy sector, which is thinking, how they can stabilize the grid, how they can ensure that we all have energy, and where is the energy going to come from. But what I think is very important is, and I think I put these columns on purpose, is that quite often these sectors really do not only see each other, but talk to each other. And I think this is where, as we enter into this area of climate change and climate change impacts, we need to really see the huge system efficiencies that are if we actually start to think about these sectors together. And I'm thinking again of my colleague from Iran. We are seeing it in Spain. I think there's a lot of system, benefits from seeing these sectors. Because I think my question is, are we blind as water scientists to other sectors that are critical to us? Is the decisions, for example, of building a power station, or for example, and in this case, I will put my hat of IPCC, a fossil power station, coming from gas or coming from coal, is that going to impact our sector of water? Often we're not going to think about it. They might even be doing it in our catchment, and we don't really think about it. And if the option, for example, would be to opt for renewables, how would that impact our sector? As water planners, if any of you are here, have you ever thought about this? What is the water accounting? How does it translate into real kind of water rights? So, in a way, as water scientists, and when I say water scientists, I include everyone. I include engineers, I include sociologists, I include lawyers, I include economists, because we're all water scientists. We are all water scientists. I myself am a geographer, so I'm a generalist, but I love working with hydrogeologists, for example, since my expertise is groundwater. But I think we can bring much more, so in a way we need to first integrate as scientists together, all our disciplines, and then reach out to other sectors. Because if you think about it, we talk about nexus transformation. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about reaching out to other sectors and understanding their needs and their pressures and their drivers so we can actually see how we can work together because we have benefits on both sides. And then if we start to move to nexus thinking, you then would have this, where water reaches out to food. And if we think about it, what we just heard before, you know, in India, such a huge percentage of water use is agriculture. We have to talk to agriculture. And they probably have to talk to us, you know, because we depend on each other. But we also have to reach out to energy. For example, at the moment in my country, we're in the midst of really trying to make a very deep transformation on our energy systems. And this will basically mean we have to talk to water. Because as we shift, for example, probably to solar energy, that's the logical system for Spain, being a very sunny country, it has implications because we're going to be, you know, putting a lot of, for example, solar photovoltaic across our catchments. Where do we put it? You know, and also, what are the benefits in the fact that we're going to possibly liberate kind of water, in this case probably from ecological flows that are very damaged at the moment. But also because, in a way, all the other options, for example, when you're thinking about drought, in Spain or even in France as they had this summer, when you're thinking of other options, other energy options, like for example nuclear or thermal power, when you have a drought, you might not be able to cool your power stations. So this thinking is now here. But let's not forget that we still have ecosystem boundaries. You know, all these have to be done within a kind of, you know, an understanding that there are limits to our systems, that we cannot, you know, wish that we, you know, if we build another reservoir, it's going to magically fill with water when we actually know that it's very likely in our areas there's going to be even less water. So you're going to have a very huge investment, you know, into the long term that might not actually deliver. And in fact, there might be other things you can do, like changing your agricultural system, changing to other crops, or the way you manage the soils, like for example regenerative farming, which is basically taking care and ensuring that the soil moisture retains in the ground. And that might be much more effective in the long term. It's just a different kind of investment. And quite often, in terms of returns, it's much more equitable in terms of who is going to benefit from that investment. However, the management of that investment is a complex system because you have many, many agents. So from the point of view of action, it's much easier to take one measure, of course, but that's not the system, that's probably not the measure we need. That's what we have to think. We're entering into a very new space where we have to really use the best of human ingenuity in how we manage resources. So I'm now going to, you know, quickly enter into the last part of my presentation, where we're talking about actionable knowledge. And what I put here is an example of how what we actually, and I'm now going to start to refer for what we're doing in my country. When we're talking about water and food, what we know, and often, again, because we come from the water sector, we only see the consequences of bad soil management when we have sediments in our reservoirs, you know, and we have these events, you know, where basically we're talking about, oh, but if you think about it, to manage sediments in your reservoirs, there's nothing you can do in your system, absolutely nothing. It's only the way that farmers manage their land that is going to solve the sediment problem. You're fixing an end of pipe problem, but to really go to the root, you need to actually change the agricultural system. And that's one of the things that, for example, we're starting to think about in Spain when you talk about regenerative agriculture, which is this idea of a very old system of farming, when you really don't intervene so much in the soil. And you keep the soil structure, you know, which is absolutely fundamental because, you know, then you retain the water in the soil, but also, you know, you avoid all these kind of, you know, sediments, which in a context, again, of climate change can create a huge hazard in the way you're managing your infrastructure, your water infrastructure. In energy and food, another part of the kind of nexus, you know, for example, as I said, in Spain, and I think France as well, but I think it's also been done in this region, we're now turning, for example, for agrivoltaic systems. Why? Because in a way, when you think about it, and I'm now going to talk about the last case of water, energy, and food, can you have these integrated systems where you basically have, in some areas in Spain, entering the discussions now, which is going to be very tough, when we would have to take water rights away, because basically we're in the red. we're taking too much water out of the system already, when we know we're going to have even less water in the future because of climate change, which basically you have to reallocate or deallocate. You have to, basically go from areas that are irrigated, possibly, if we really were serious about it, migrate them to dryland again. And in that case, how do you secure the income for farmers? So one possibility, and I know, for example, in India, you've gone down the road of solar photovoltaic. When you're dealing with groundwater, that can be a bit of a mixed blessing. But one area that is being considered is agrivoltaic. If you could, for example, with the right crops, and I think there's a lot of things that need to be researched in this context. But for some crops, like for example in my country, vineyards is a very traditional crop that was tend to irrigation to increase the productivity. But in fact, as we move into climate change, vineyards can really benefit from having shade, to a limited extent, because it would keep the soil moisture in the ground. But more importantly, we don't irrigate, and therefore we take pressure off the system. But at the same time, we could do it under regenerative agriculture systems, which basically means you don't have to till the land. So the questions, and again, we're still kind of entering this space now. As I say, we are doing 2 research projects at the moment on this. One is a European funded project called RESET, and another project is with the Nature Conservancy and the Known, which is one of the big food producers, to try and understand these systems. But I was very, very it was quite good to see. Last week we had the big Environment Congress in Spain, which happens every 2 years, and there was one case being presented by a farmer in the Albacete region, and this is precisely what he's doing, because he's adapting already to the changes. Farmers are, let me tell you, they're really adaptive as agents. They are our allies. If we explain to them the risks, and they understand risk very well because they deal with it every day, I think then we can actually help them shift to kind of more systems that basically will ensure their long-term income. Okay, and this is very, very important. As we take these kind of adaptation strategies and we move to this nexus transformation where we start to see the other sectors and start to take actions together, we still need to know. We need to monitor our systems. It's a bit like a patient in the hospital. We need to take the kind of readings of all the major systems and actually understand what is happening. Because otherwise we might think that a measure is going to be effective because we think it's going to be effective. No, we need to know and measure, because otherwise, we will not really understand whether, the system is actually being transformed. So, what I mean by MEL is monitoring, evaluation, and the last one is the one I actually like the most, and learning. We need learning systems, and this brings me to the question that was raised before about multidisciplinarity. This idea that we need to change our training and our teaching, and and I actually think, I was at COP 2 weeks ago, and just let me tell you that one of probably the most important things that I took away is a youth that is incredibly active at the moment. And they're not just protesting anymore. They are coming with solutions. So I think we need to also give them room into the decision making. Always bring the youth, because they come with this system thinking to them is absolutely natural. That the digital children of a generation that really understands systems thinking. So let's give them more space. So one of the examples that I bring you is a concept called environmental intelligence, and it's this idea that we now have local sensors that we could actually use. In this project, which one of the things I really like about it is based on an open science approach, which is this idea that you can actually give relatively low-cost sensors. In this case, to farmers. We actually have one project in one of the largest regions in Europe called the Castilla-León region. It's north of Madrid, where I live. And we're actually working directly with farmers and farmer unions. In this case, we're doing a paired experiment where we have one farmland which has got traditional kind of agriculture, and the other one is going to do this low-till regenerative farming. And we're going to really measure, in terms of metrics, what does it mean about, for example, water flow? Soil moisture, what does it mean in terms of evaporation from these different systems? And that then is actually what we're going to try and really simulate with this tool. So we have, on the one hand, local sensors. We're also going to be satellite imaging. We're also going to be using large-scale models. And basically, we're going to try and simulate, okay, in this region, if we actually change the whole system in this very large region, not for your countries are very large, but for Europe, this is a relatively large region, what would it mean in terms of metrics? You know, would we actually deliver in terms of water? You know, how would it change? And to me, what was very interesting is when we approached the Duero River Basin Authority, who has been very, very supportive of this project, one of the things that they were very interested is they said, well, in terms of water, you're not going to tell us much, because in a way they already have relatively good systems where they have very relatively good monitoring of the river flows and the river gauges, but they're completely blind to land. So they understand now, for example, we were talking to the people that deal with floods, that they only see a very, very small part of the river, and they know that they need to understand the whole catchment. So they were very interested, because we're giving them information at the moment they don't have. So, you know, I've put the website there in case you want to have a look, but basically it's this idea that we're developing this low-cost sensing kind of tools that can give us the information to, for example, the managers, but also to the farmers. And then they can actually understand their system, you know, a bit like, you know, and I think this is what kind of new technologies and digitalization can actually give us. So, for example, the other case, and this was being developed by King's College in London, is natural flood management, which is this idea that you give room to the river. I know in your countries probably this is actually much harder, because, you know, you have a heavily dense basins quite often. But, you know, at the end of the day, quite often the river is going to find its own space, you know, and when we have extreme events. So I think this idea that you can give a bit more room, you know, so you basically have this capacity in the landscape to store water, or a way to somehow coexist, I think is going to be very important. And this is exactly what they're trying, in this case, in the Thames Basin in the UK, when they're deploying low-cost distributed monitoring to evaluate natural flood management. And then the other second case that I'm bringing to you is this idea, this concept of enhanced information systems. It's very similar to environmental intelligence. It's from a project that we're running with a number of partners from the University of Valencia, but we also have cases from Morocco and from Algeria. So, you know, countries that have, you know, tough conditions at the moment, and they're on the hotspot of climate change impacts. And in a way, one of the things that I like about this approach, which to me is new, is that it blends the old with the new. Let's not all get excited about technology. I mean, we all have our phones, we all use them, but we also have traditional knowledge. And one of the things that I think came out also from the water chapter, and indeed from the Working Group 2 report, is that we really have to value traditional knowledge. As I say, there's nothing new under the sun. I'm thinking of canats, for example, in our region, you know, when, you know, groundwater systems that now, in Spain, for example, we're now restoring these old systems because we understand that they have very valuable knowledge from hundreds of years of managing water. You know, so we should not forget, you know, the fact that we have these traditional systems that have a lot of very, very valuable knowledge. And we also have the users themselves, which have a lot of knowledge. And then, of course, groundwater managers. You know, the practitioners, the ones that are actually at the forefront, you know, in the you know, first line of attack, as it were, you know, with dealing with these changes. I think we should also talk to them and what they're experiencing on the ground. In Spain, I helped contribute to the impact on climate change for our country in the water chapter as well. And one of the things that was interesting is we had a report from the research body, CEDEX, saying what was going to happen with the forecasts. But the person from the Spanish Climate Change Office said, no, hang on, let's talk to the water managers from the river basins, because those models are old. We now have impacts that are being felt by the practitioners, and they're talking to us about it all the time. So let's incorporate that knowledge as well. Okay, and then innovative tools. For example, we develop a set of cards that we're going to be using with farmers in these areas, where basically we're trying to develop citizen science project. I their users, as I say, they're potential scientists, we can incorporate them and work with them, or even foresight tools where we tap into expert knowledge, which is much more intangible, is from a lot of experiences, like all older people, you know, retired people. We should talk to them because they have a lot of valuable knowledge that can actually help us. Like, for example, this is the Delphi technique that we have used as a foresight technique. Okay, and I think this is my last slide. As we turn into water security and climate resilient development, which is this idea that what we're here for, you know, we actually want to ensure that we ensure water security so we can actually have, you know, human well-being and kind of planetary health into the long term. So we're talking about this deep system transformation. And what you can see there is the final kind of thinking on the IPCC that we can move to this kind of, you know, pathway towards climate resilient development. So, and this is much more complicated, but what you can see there is that you have the pathways, you have resilience, you have climate action, and you have development. This idea that it's a system, and in a way, we have to avoid that scenario at the bottom, which is, you know, this fragility when we enter this cascade in a way of risks. And we have to keep as far as possible to the top part of the region, which to me, you know, without a doubt, is about nexus transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elena, for this deep insight into nexus transformation and showing us what kind of tools we can use to realize this transformation to be successful. If you allow, I would like to allow, because of time constraints, 2 or 3 questions, and we collect questions.
Hello.
If you allow, we collect the questions, 2 or 3, and I would like to ask the audience to be brief in your questions. So, who would like to ask the first question over there?
Hi, Elena. I think it was a very brilliant presentation. My name is Dinesh Kumar. I am from India. My question is, you know, how do you ensure this climate resilient development and water security in a world where you are experiencing extreme climatic events? You know, as you know, many of the countries like India, China, Spain, Morocco, Mexico, and even some of the western parts of the United States, the climate variability is extremely high. So in that kind of a situation, how do you ensure water security if we have to get rid of the large dams as proposed by the previous speaker? Do you have any idea on this?
Okay, thank you.
I hope you understood the question.
Yeah, I think
we are experiencing extreme climatic events in many of these countries, especially in the hot arid tropics.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have to
so
keep brief. Briefly, we collect, and this was how to realize water security. Another question? Over there, yeah, please.
Hello again. My question is not just from Dr. Lopez, maybe from all conference, about the terminology of nexus thinking. Because we already have some other terminologies come to the water sector, for example, water productivity, integrated water resource management. Some of them has some indices to monitor and evaluate our activities. But for nexus, actually we have not much criteria how to evaluate that. This thinking has led to better outputs than previous one. So my question, because this is also a new terminology, it's not mainstream minds even in the scientific community. So maybe one of the tasks
Please
of...
don't comment. What is your question exactly?
My clear question is that I want to know some criteria for nexus thinking, how it leads to better management of water and water scarcity.
Okay, thank you. Okay, criteria. One last question over there.
Thank you, Dr. Agon. This is Professor Tawhid from MST Bangladesh. Very interesting, actually, I think, excellent presentation. I was wondering actually how to transfer this actionable knowledge to the poor country or the actual developing country, because what you showed, most of them from European communities. So how to transfer this knowledge to? So this is my actually question. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question was about water security. I think you're right. We're into an era of extremes. I mean, I'll tell you what we experienced in my own country in the summer. We had a drought, which then combined with fires. We've had the largest area burnt this year than ever. And then we also had extreme events in the summer. And we also had heat waves. And we now have seen, I'm bringing health because only Professor Shah mentioned it, and I think health is one of the biggest things that we can think about in the systems transformation. So I think my reply to you is that I think one of the things that we're going to struggle with is that you need to go to the local level. You need to see, okay, how does this work, for example, and that's why I was referring to a specific basin. You know, what do we need, what actions do we need to take, for example, in the Duero Basin, or, you know, in order to deal with the fact, and the engineers there, for example, were already commenting that because we've had so many burnt areas, you know, the sediments, they're going to really impact now on the water supply of that area that was burnt. So I think they will have to really think, they will have to be talking, and I know this is, for us it's new thinking, but they need to really be talking to the foresters, because as we say in Spain, the forest fires are put out in the winter, not in the summer. So I think, you know, one of the ideas is that, for example, if you're an engineer and you're thinking about managing, for example, a reservoir, you know, like it's one of the examples, then you need to be thinking about the whole catchment, not just your reservoir. And how you develop monitors, like indicators, that basically not only are you monitoring your dam, but also what's happening, you know, in the whole catchment in terms of the land management and the vegetation management, you know, so that then you're actually talking about soil as well. I know it's not a comfortable answer because it's not very clear. Well, it is clear, it's just, it's a new way of thinking that you need to really incorporate many other sectors when you're managing your reservoir, for example.
But you will still attend the conference. If you have urgent questions later, she's still there.
And in relation to the criteria question, I think you're right. I mean, nexus thinking, to me it's the same. Integrated water resource management. Before it was integrated water resource management, I think we're really talking about integrated resource management, which is different. Because then we're talking about water, we're talking about food, we're talking about land, we're talking about energy. So these are the systems, but we talk also about social systems. Let's not forget about culture, you know, and the social systems, but that we don't think, and these are the agents that are using water, so we need to integrate these systems. I think, just bringing it to you, one, and maybe also linking to the third question, we now have the SDGs. I know that they're not the Sustainable Development Goals. They come with a whole battery of indicators that you could use. And if you take all the SDGs, that's systems thinking. Just take you know, in your case, I would say, for example, and maybe the same to my other colleague, the SDGs apply globally. We now have a big UN water conference coming up in March. So if you just try to even take those indicators from the SDGs and really apply them to where you work, engage with people in your country, because they have to implement these SDGs. And then we're talking about trade-offs and synergies. But to really be able to analyze trade-offs and synergies, you can do it, of course, with very complex modeling. That's what some countries are doing. But you can even do it on evidence-based, you know, in terms of getting data from what's happening in your basin or in your local area. And try to really see the trends. What's happening, you know, and because that's going to really, you know, give you a picture of the area where you're working. And this would also apply to the case of Bangladesh, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much, Dr. Elena, for the answers. And I think we still have a nice present for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elena Lopez-Gunn and Professor Andreas Harstrick for your wonderful insights. I would now like to request Professor Andreas to please present the souvenir to Dr. Elena.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Andreas. We will now have a short coffee break, but before we take the coffee break, please allow me a few minutes to take you to the program until the next plenary session. As we depart from this room, let us first take a group picture. The group picture will be taken in the lobby of the hotel. Our student volunteers will guide you to the location. After the group picture, please proceed towards the coffee counters in the foyer outside this room. After the coffee break, we will have 3 parallel sessions, which will start exactly at 11 a.m. You can see the details of these sessions on the screen. After the parallel sessions, we will proceed for lunch. Lunch will be arranged in 3 different rooms, Thanyaburi 1, Alberto, and Food Exchange. Our volunteers will be there in the lobby to guide you to these rooms. Finally, and most importantly, we will begin the official opening session at 1:25 p.m. I request everyone to please be here by 1:20 p.m.